There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when you realize something has been going on for a long time and you were the last one to see it, clearly. I didn't arrive at that quiet through anger. I never do. I arrived at it the way I've arrived at most things in my life. Slowly, carefully, and only after I'd looked at the documentation. My name is Margaret Elaine Coburn. I spent 31 years in education, 22 of them as a principal, first at Westfield Elementary in Columbus, Ohio, and later at Hartley Ridge Middle School, where I stayed until I retired in 2019. I mention that not for credentials, but for context. Because the kind of person I became over those decades, the kind who reads every line of every document before signing, who keeps files the way other people keep photographs, that person didn't arrive by accident. She was built by necessity, line by line, year by year. The house on Sycamore Bend Drive was a four-bedroom colonial in a quiet suburb east of Columbus. Good school district, mature trees, a covered front porch that my son Daniel had admired out loud the first time we drove through that neighborhood, back in the spring of 2014. He and his wife, Renata, had just had their first child. They were young, hopeful, and financially stretched in the particular way that young families often are not reckless, just not ready. Not yet. Daniel's credit wasn't where it needed to be. Renata's income was part-time. The bank had made its position clear enough without making it personal. They weren't going to qualify on their own, not for that house, not in that neighborhood, not at that time. So I stepped in. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It felt like the natural thing. You use what you've built to give the people you love a foundation they can grow from. I had the credit score, the retirement income, the clean financial history. The loan went through in my name. The title went into my name. The deed recorded at the Franklin County Recorder's Office on March 14th, 2014, listed Margaret Elaine Coburn as the sole owner of the property at 4,417 Sycamore Bend Drive. I made the down payment. I made every monthly mortgage payment for the first 3 years. After that, I arranged for Daniel to take over the payments directly, which he did inconsistently at first, then more regularly. When he missed months, I covered the gaps without mentioning them. I paid for the furnace replacement in 2016, the roof repair in 2018, the kitchen renovation in 2021, which Renata had requested with a kind of casual certainty that I chose, at the time, to interpret as enthusiasm rather than expectation. I understand now that I was doing a lot of interpreting in those years. Some people mistake silence for permission. I didn't see that clearly then, but I do now. The moment that finally shifted. Something in me came on a Sunday afternoon in October of 2023. Daniel and Renata were hosting a small gathering at the house neighbors, a few of Renata's co-workers, some people I didn't recognize. Over the course of the afternoon, I was introduced more than once as Daniel's mother or a relative from across town. Not inaccurate, exactly, but incomplete in the particular way that omissions can sometimes carry more weight than an outright lie. At one point, a neighbor asked how long they'd lived there. Renata answered smoothly, without hesitation. "Almost 10 years," she said. "We love this neighborhood. We." I didn't say anything. I excused myself to the kitchen and refilled my glass of water. I stood at the counter for a moment, the counter I had paid for, and looked out at the backyard, at the oak tree. At the yard Daniel used to run through as a boy. Before any of this existed, I didn't feel angry standing there. I felt something quieter than that, something I hadn't quite named yet. Later that evening, after the guests had gone, Daniel came to me. He spoke in that low, measured tone he uses when he has already decided something and is working to present it as a suggestion. He said it would probably be better, going forward, if I didn't bring up the house in conversation, that it tended to confuse people. And then, with the particular gentleness of someone who believes the hard part is already behind them. He said it might be time to think about transferring the deed into his and Renata's name, since I wasn't living there, since I was getting older, since it would simplify things for everyone. I looked at my son for a long moment. Then I told him I'd think about it. I drove home. I didn't call anyone. I didn't turn on the television. I sat down at my kitchen table in the quiet of that October night, and I opened the lower drawer of my filing cabinet, the one I hadn't needed to open in quite some time. And I took out the folder labeled in my own handwriting. 4417 Sycamore Bend. I didn't read it that night. I just set it on the table in front of me and looked at it. That was enough. For then. The folder sat on my kitchen table for 2 days before I opened it. That might sound like hesitation. It wasn't. It was the same discipline I used to ask of my staff when a difficult situation landed on the desk. Don't respond to the moment, respond to the facts. The moment passes. The facts remain. So I waited until Wednesday morning. I made coffee. I sat in the good light by the window, the one that faces the back garden, and I opened it. Everything was there, exactly where I had left it. The original loan documents, the deed, the title insurance policy. 9 years of payment records first from my own account, then the quiet gap-fill receipts I had kept without ever mentioning to Daniel. Property tax statements going back to 2014, contractor invoices from the furnace, the roof, the kitchen renovation, each one organized by year, paper-clipped at the corner. The way I had organized student files for 3 decades, there was something steadying about seeing it all laid out like that. Not satisfying, exactly, just grounding. The way facts tend to be. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something quieter than vindication, something closer to clarity arriving after a long delay. The first memory that came to me wasn't from 2014. It came from earlier, the summer of 2011, when Daniel had moved back home for a few months after college. He was 23, smart, a little restless, the kind of young man who had grown up with enough comfort that waiting still felt foreign to him. I remember a Tuesday evening. I was at the kitchen table going through transfer paperwork I'd brought home from the office. I always brought too much work home. Daniel came in through the side door, dropped his bag by the stairs, opened the refrigerator, and stood there for a long moment just looking at it. "There's nothing to eat," he said. I didn't look up. "There's chicken on the second shelf and rice on the stove." I mean, nothing easy. I remember the sound of the refrigerator door closing, the faint smell of cut grass drifting in through the screen, the particular stillness of a summer evening that has nothing urgent left in it. "Effort is how things become yours," I said. He laughed a little, not dismissively, just lightly, and he made the chicken. We didn't talk much that night, but it was a comfortable quiet. The kind that exists between people who still understand each other. I've thought about that conversation more than I probably should have, because somewhere between then and now, something in that understanding quietly came apart, and neither of us noticed until it had already been gone for a while. The second memory came later, that same Wednesday, while I was on my afternoon walk. I try to do that. When I'm processing something difficult, let the thinking happen at a slower pace without forcing it. I found myself back at the closing. March 2014. A cold morning, bright in the particular way that late winter mornings in Columbus can be bright, sharp and clear, and a little unforgiving. Daniel and Renata had come with me to the title company's office downtown. Renata was wearing a grey coat I hadn't seen before. She was holding the baby Marcus, just 4 months old, and she looked genuinely happy that morning. Grateful, even. That part I remember clearly. The closing agent, a woman named Patricia, efficient and warm in equal measure, had spread the documents across the table and walked us through each one carefully. When she reached the deed, she paused and looked up. "Mrs. Coburn," she said. Just to confirm, this property will be titled solely in your name. That's correct, I said. Daniel nodded. Renata smiled down at the baby. Nobody objected. Nobody asked a follow-up question. I signed where Patricia indicated, and the house became mine in the eyes of Franklin County, the state of Ohio, and the institution that had issued the mortgage. What I remember most about that moment is how unremarkable it felt. Just a procedure. Just the ordinary mechanics of an ordinary transaction. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than any of us understood at the time. The third memory came that evening, while I was going through the kitchen renovation contract from 2021. Near the bottom of the second page, in the standard language of permit applications, was the property owner's name listed for the record. Margaret Elaine Coburn. I had stood in that kitchen for 2 weeks while the work was being done. Renata had shown me tile samples and cabinet hardware, had walked me through her vision for the new layout with a warmth that felt genuine and unhurried. There had been afternoons during that renovation that I had genuinely enjoyed, the two of us standing in the half-finished space, talking about colour and light and what a room can feel like when it finally becomes what it was meant to be. "You're going to love it," she told me one afternoon, pressing a paint swatch into my hand. "It's going to feel completely different." I remember thinking, it already feels like somewhere I'm visiting. I didn't say that. I approved the tile. I wrote the check. I told myself the feeling would pass. By Thursday morning, I had read through the entire folder twice. I had made a short list on a legal pad, not of grievances, but of facts. Ownership status, payment history, permit records, outstanding mortgage balance, which I verified through the lender's online portal, property tax status, current and fully paid. The list was clean. The facts were uncomplicated. What was also clear, and this was the part that required the most sitting with, was that Daniel had made his request not as a son asking a favor, but as someone who had quietly, gradually come to believe that the house was already his, that my name on the paperwork was a procedural leftover, a formality that had served its purpose and could now be retired, perhaps along with me. I stayed with that understanding for a long time. I didn't rush past it. Then I picked up the phone and called Gerald Okafor. Gerald had been my personal attorney since 2008, estate planning mostly, with some contract work over the years. He was careful, deliberate, and the kind of man who never used 2 sentences when one would do. I gave him the shape of the situation, the property, the title, the conversation with Daniel, and he listened without interrupting once. When I finished, there was a brief pause on the line. "Margaret," he said, "you've kept the records. Everything." I said, "From the beginning." A shorter pause this time. "Come in Friday morning," he said. "Bring the folder." I told him I would. I set the phone down, closed the filing cabinet, and finished the last of my coffee. Outside, a few leaves were coming down from the maple in the backyard, early for the season, but not unusual. I watched them for a moment and thought about nothing in particular. Sometimes the decision is the calm part. Everything that follows is just procedure. Gerald's office was on the 14th floor of a building on South High Street, downtown Columbus. I had been there enough times over the years that the receptionist knew my name before I offered it. She asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. I sat in the chair nearest the window and looked out at the grey October sky while I waited, the kind of flat, even sky that makes the city look like a photograph of itself. Gerald came out to meet me personally, which he didn't always do. He shook my hand, held the conference room door, and we settled across from each other at his table, the way we had settled across from each other many times before. No preamble. No small talk beyond what courtesy required. That was one of the things I had always appreciated about Gerald. He understood that some meetings don't need warming up. I set the folder on the table between us. He opened it. For the next 20 minutes, he read without speaking. I didn't hurry him. I had learned over 30 years in school administration that the people worth trusting are the ones who finish the document before forming an opinion. Gerald was that kind of person. He turned each page with the same unhurried attention, paused occasionally, made small notations on his legal pad in a handwriting I had never quite been able to read. I watched the city through the window and let him work. When he finished, he closed the folder and set his pen down parallel to the edge of the table, a small, precise gesture that I recognized as his way of signaling he was ready. "The deed is clean," he said. "Title is yours, uncontested. Mortgage in your name, payments documented." He glanced briefly at one of his notes. "The gap payments, the ones you made when Daniel fell short, you have receipts for those as well." "Separate envelope," I said, "back of the folder." He found it, reviewed it without rushing, nodded once. "Margaret," he said, "your son cannot compel a transfer. He has no legal standing to request one, morally or emotionally. Perhaps he believes otherwise. Legally, he has nothing." "I know that," I said. "I want to make sure you understand the full range of your options before we go any further." He walked me through them, all of them, without editorializing. I could do nothing, simply maintain the status quo and let the situation settle on its own. I could send a formal letter establishing my intentions regarding the property going forward. I could initiate a sale. I could formalize a lease arrangement that recognized the current occupants as tenants rather than de facto owners. I could, if I chose, begin proceedings that would require them to vacate entirely. I listened to each option the way I used to listen, to a staff member presenting solutions to a difficult situation without reacting to any single one, without letting my expression give away where I was already leaning. When Gerald finished, I asked him one question. If Daniel were to attempt to initiate a transfer himself, file anything with the county, approach the mortgage lender, take any unilateral action without my knowledge, what would happen? Gerald looked at me steadily across the table. "He'd be stopped at every point," he said. "The lender won't discuss the mortgage with a non-borrower. The county recorder won't process a transfer without your notarized signature. Any title company involved in a future transaction would run a title search and find your name immediately." He paused, just long enough to let that settle. "The paperwork already has your name on it, Margaret. That doesn't change because someone wishes it would." I nodded slowly and looked down at the folder for a moment. "Then here's what I'd like to do," I said. I told him. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, I noticed something shift slightly in his expression. Not surprise, because Gerald rarely permitted himself surprise, but something quieter. A kind of measured professional respect that he would never have named out loud, and didn't need to. "That's measured," he said, "and it's entirely within your rights." "I know," I said. "That's why I chose it." What I had decided was not dramatic. It wasn't designed to be. I would not transfer the property. I would not initiate eviction. I would not call a family meeting, send a message through an intermediary, or make any kind of announcement. Instead, I would do two things, both of them quiet, both of them procedural, and both of them completely within the ordinary authority of a property owner. First, I would instruct Gerald to send a formal letter to Daniel and Renata, not threatening, not accusatory, simply informational, confirming the current legal status of the property, the ownership structure, and my intentions going forward. The letter would also make clear, in plain language, that any future improvements, modifications, or financial decisions affecting the property required my written authorization as the titled owner. Second, I would contact the mortgage servicer and place a formal notation on the account, a servicing flag, in Gerald's language indicating that no payoff discussions, refinancing inquiries, or account modifications were to be processed without direct confirmation from me. Those two actions, taken quietly and without announcement, would accomplish something that no argument could achieve on its own. They would make the situation legible to everyone. The letter went out the following Tuesday, sent certified mail with return receipt requested. Gerald's firm handled the drafting and the delivery. It was 2 pages. The tone was precise and entirely without malice. The kind of document that says exactly what needs to be said and nothing beyond that. I know the moment Daniel received it, because he called me 47 minutes after the delivery confirmation appeared in my email. He didn't raise his voice. That surprised me briefly. What he did instead was speak in that low, carefully controlled register I recognized from his teenage years, the voice he used when he was working very hard to sound reasonable while feeling something quite different. "Mom," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't," I said. A pause. "Renata is really upset. I imagine she is," I said. "The letter explains the situation clearly. Gerald's number is at the top if either of you has legal questions." Another pause. Longer this time. "Are you really doing this?" I looked out my kitchen window. A few more leaves had come down from the maple overnight. The yard was beginning to look the way yards look in late October, a little undone, a little honest. "I'm clarifying," I said. "That's all." He didn't have an answer for that. We stayed on the line for a moment without speaking, a different kind of quiet from the comfortable silences I remembered from his childhood. Then he said he needed to go, and I told him I understood, and we said goodbye. I sat at the table for a while after that, with the phone face down in front of me. It wasn't a comfortable quiet, but it was an honest one. And after years of comfortable silences that had been covering over something unspoken, I found that I preferred the honesty. The week after the letter arrived was the kind of week that moves slowly and loudly at the same time. Daniel called twice more. The first call was an attempt at negotiation, carefully structured. The way his attempts at negotiation had always been, even as a teenager. He proposed a payment arrangement, some kind of informal agreement, where they would buy me out gradually over time. He used phrases like, "fair to everyone," and "what's best for the family," with the particular precision of someone who has rehearsed the wording and believes the wording will be enough. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him that any formal arrangement would need to go through Gerald. He said he didn't think that was necessary. I told him that I did, and that Gerald's number was on the letter. The second call came from Renata directly, which caught me off guard not because it was unwelcome, but because she had always maintained a careful distance from the financial conversations over the years. I had noticed that over time, without remarking on it, her tone on the phone was different from Daniel's, less controlled, more wounded in the way that people sound when they have decided that injury is their strongest available position. She said she felt blindsided, that she had never expected me to treat the house like a transaction. She let that word sit there with some deliberate weight, and I took a breath before I answered. "Renata," I said, "I've been treating it like a transaction since March of 2014. I just wasn't the only one who forgot that." She didn't respond to that directly. Instead, she moved to the children. Marcus was 9 now, Lily was 6. Did I understand what uncertainty did to children? Did I want to be responsible for disrupting their lives? I understood very well what uncertainty did to children. I had spent 22 years managing the consequences of it, in hallways and classrooms and parent meetings that nobody wanted to be sitting in. But I also understood what it meant to build something carefully, over years, and then watch it be quietly taken from you, not through aggression, not through confrontation, but through the slow confidence of people who had come to believe that your patience was simply the background condition of their lives, that your silence was the same as your surrender. I told Renata that nobody was being displaced, that the letter was a clarification, not an eviction notice, that the situation going forward was exactly what it had always been. I owned the house, they lived in it, and that arrangement would simply be explicit rather than assumed. She said she needed time to think. I told her to take it. On the financial side, things moved with the quiet efficiency of institutional process, which is to say, they moved exactly as I had expected them to. Gerald filed the servicing flag with the mortgage company by the end of that first week. 3 days later, I received a confirmation letter from the servicer, a single paragraph, bureaucratic in tone and precise in meaning, acknowledging the notation on the account and confirming that all future modification requests would require my direct written authorization before any action could be taken. I read it once, set it on the table, then filed it in the folder behind the certified mail confirmation. Around the same time, I contacted a property management firm on the east side of Columbus, not to list the house, not yet, but to request a current market valuation and a formal rental assessment. I wanted to know what the property was worth in plain numbers, not sentimentally, not in the way that memory inflates value, in the language that institutions recognize and respond to. The assessment came back 10 days later. The house on Sycamore Bend Drive had appreciated considerably since 2014. The rental market in that part of Columbus was strong, the report noted, particularly for four-bedroom colonials in established school districts. The numbers were, in the straightforward way that numbers often are, clarifying. I didn't share that information with anyone. I set the assessment in the folder beside the servicing confirmation, closed the drawer, and made a note on my legal pad. In the meantime, the social lane had developed its own quiet momentum, the way these things tend to when people run out of direct options and start looking for side doors. I became aware, through a mutual family friend named Donna Pruitt, a woman I had known since my early teaching years, reliable and well-meaning in equal measure, that Daniel and Renata had begun circulating a version of events among people in their circle. The version involved words like controlling and sudden change, and we had no idea. Donna reported this to me, with the particular expression of someone who wants you to know what is being said, without wanting to be held responsible for having said it herself. I recognized the expression. I had seen it across my desk more times than I could count. I thanked her. I did not react beyond that. What I had learned over 30 years of institutional life was that the narrative people construct in the early stages of a conflict almost always reveals more about their own position than they intend it. 2. The fact that Daniel and Renata were telling people they had been blindsided told me something important. They had expected me to behave as I always had, quietly, accommodatingly. Without paperwork, they had mistaken consistency for passivity. That was their error, not mine. About 2 weeks after the letter, Daniel made his first procedural move. He contacted the Franklin County Recorder's Office. I know this because Gerald had established an alert on the property record as a standard precaution when we began and made an inquiry about the process for transferring a deed. He did not file anything. He simply asked questions. The Recorder's Office is not an adversarial institution. They answered his questions accurately and completely. What he would have learned, sitting across from whoever took that inquiry, was straightforward. A deed transfer required the current owner's notarized signature, a completed conveyance form, and the applicable transfer fees. That, without the owner's cooperation, the process could not move forward under any circumstances. That there was no mechanism, legal or otherwise, by which an occupant could compel a transfer of title, regardless of how long they had lived in a property or how many improvements had been made during their time there. He wasn't expecting that answer. I'm fairly certain of that. I know, because he called Gerald's office the following morning, not me this time, Gerald, which meant he had moved out of the emotional lane and into the procedural one, and that was, in its own way, a form of progress. Gerald called me afterward with his characteristic economy. He's beginning to understand the geometry of the situation, he said. Good, I said. He asked whether there was any path to an amicable resolution. I looked out the window for a moment before I answered. The light outside had the low, thin quality of a November afternoon that has already given most of what it had to give. There always has been, I said. I've been waiting for him to look for it. Renata made her own move the following week, through a different channel entirely. She reached out to Daniel's aunt, his father's sister, a woman named Carol, who had always occupied a kind of carefully maintained neutral ground in the family. Carol was thoughtful, genuinely kind, and deeply uncomfortable with conflict of any kind. She called me on a Thursday afternoon. I could hear it in her voice from the first sentence. The discomfort of someone who has agreed to carry a message they didn't write and aren't sure they believe. I let her say what she had come to say without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her one question. Carol, do you know whose name is on the deed? A pause. I assumed. Mine, I said. It has been since March of 2014. I have the original documents. Gerald Okafor has certified copies. The Franklin County Recorder has the official record. I let that sit for just a moment. I don't say that to be harsh. I say it because the bigger picture that Renata asked you to help me see is actually quite a bit smaller than the one I'm already looking at. Carol was quiet for a moment. I could hear her adjusting in her chair. I'll be honest with you, Margaret, she said finally. I didn't know any of the details. Most people didn't, I said. That was by design. Just not my design. You can't take what was never yours. We ended the call warmly. Carol bore no responsibility for the position she had been placed in, and I held no difficulty with her. But I was aware after I set the phone down that the social pressure campaign had reached its natural outer limit. The family circle had been canvassed. The intermediaries had been sent. And what they had found, when they arrived, was not a confused or emotionally fragile woman who could be gently redirected. They had found the paperwork. 1 p.m. November arrived quietly. The trees on my street had gone fully bare by the first week, and the mornings had taken on that particular Ohio chill that settles into everything. The car, the coat, the corners of the day. I had always liked that time of year. There was a clarity to it, a stripping away of what wasn't necessary. A kind of honesty that the warmer months didn't always offer. That was, in its own way, an accurate description of what was happening with the property on Sycamore Bend Drive. Gerald and I had spoken 3 times over the preceding 2 weeks. The conversations were efficient and without drama, the way conversations with Gerald tended to be. We had identified the path forward, discussed the variables, and agreed on the sequence of steps. I want to be careful not to make that sound more calculated than it was. It wasn't strategy pursued for its own sake. It was simply the application of process to a situation that had been allowed to drift without process for far too long. There is a difference between those two things, and I think it matters. The first institutional step came through the mortgage servicer, because the loan was in my name and the payments had, over the years, become informal. Daniel's contributions had never been structured through an official assumption agreement, never documented in any way the lender recognized. Gerald advised me to formalize the payment arrangement, not to create hardship, but to create clarity. We contacted the servicer and established that all future payments would route through my account exclusively. Any informal arrangement between myself and the occupants of the property was a private matter and would not affect the loan's official structure in any way. The servicer processed the change without comment. From their perspective, it was simply an account holder clarifying her preferences. Routine, unremarkable. From Daniel's perspective, it was something considerably different. He called Gerald's office the morning after receiving the servicer's notification letter. Gerald's assistant took the call. Daniel was not shouting. By the account she relayed to me later, but he was speaking with the compressed urgency of someone who has just realized that the room they are standing in is smaller than they believed, and that the walls are not where they thought. They were. He asked what was happening. Gerald's assistant told him, politely and without elaboration, that any questions regarding the property should be directed to Mr. Okafor in writing. That was, I think, the first moment the performance gave way to something closer to genuine panic. Up until that point, I believe Daniel had been operating on the assumption that this would resolve the way things had always resolved between us, that I would express my concern, that there would be some uncomfortable days, and that eventually I would accommodate, that the situation would return to the shape it had always held, because it always had before. The service's letter made clear that this time the shape had changed permanently. The second step involved the property taxes. The annual tax statement for 4,417 Sycamore Bend Drive was due in February. For the past several years, Daniel had been the one submitting the payment, or rather, I had been covering the amount, and he had been the one sending it in, an arrangement that had drifted into existence without either of us formally acknowledging it. This year, I contacted the Franklin County Auditor's Office directly and updated the mailing address for all property correspondence to my address. Tax statements, assessment notices, any official communication related to the property would now come to me first, not to the house on Sycamore Bend, not to Daniel's inbox, to my filing cabinet, where it had always belonged. I mention these steps not because each one was dramatic in isolation, but because together they formed a pattern worth understanding. The servicing flag, the payment structure, the mailing address update, each one individually small, each one, taken together, the quiet and methodical reassertion of an ownership that had never actually transferred, only blurred. The blurring had happened gradually, through years of accommodation and assumption. The reassertion happened the same way, patiently, without announcement. Around this time, Renata made what I came to understand was her final strategic attempt. She retained a real estate attorney, a different firm, not Gerald's, and that attorney sent a letter to Gerald's office, raising the concept of an implied ownership interest. The argument, rendered in careful legal language, suggested that because Daniel and Renata had occupied the property for nearly a decade, had contributed toward the mortgage, and had invested in improvements to the home, they might have established some form of equitable claim to the property. Gerald called me the evening he received it. He read me the relevant section over the phone in his measured way, and when he finished, there was a brief pause on the line, the kind that precedes a careful answer rather than an uncertain one. "It's not without precedent as a theory," he said. "In certain circumstances." "What circumstances?" I asked. "Primarily where there is no clear documentation of the ownership structure, where the titled owner cannot demonstrate the nature of the original arrangement." A short pause. "That is not the situation here?" "No," I said. "It isn't." Gerald drafted the response over the following 2 days. I reviewed it before it went out. It was 4 pages, and it was the kind of document that closes doors rather than opens them. It included a complete payment history, every mortgage payment, every tax payment, every contractor invoice demonstrating clearly and without ambiguity that the financial relationship between myself and the occupants of the property had always been that of an owner, supporting occupants, not co-investors, building any form of shared equity. It included the original loan documents, the deed, the title insurance policy, the permit records listing me as property owner for every improvement made to the structure, 9 years of receipts, organized by category and date, the way I had always organized them. The attorney on the other side did not respond with a counter-argument. He sent a 1-paragraph acknowledgement that the matter was under review. That was the last communication I received from that office. Daniel called me himself on a Thursday evening in the middle of November. Not in the controlled, negotiating register of the earlier calls. Not in the wounded tone Renata had used. This was something different, quieter, and in some ways harder to sit with, because underneath it, I could hear the sound of a person who has finally exhausted every available angle and is left standing in the plain truth of where they are. "Mom," he said, "I didn't think you'd actually do this." I let the sentence sit between us for a moment before I answered. "Daniel," I said, "I haven't done anything to you. I've clarified what was always true. The house is mine. It has been since the beginning. I've been paying for it, maintaining it, and protecting it for 9 years. What I've done recently is simply made sure that everyone who needed to understand that, including the institutions involved, understands it clearly." A long pause. I could hear him breathing. "What do you want?" he said. It was the first time he had asked me that. In 9 years of this arrangement, through every repair, every missed payment I quietly covered, every accommodation I made without naming it, he had never once asked me what I wanted. I told him that what I wanted was a conversation, a real one. Not about the house, not about documents, not about legal positions or servicing flags or county records. About what had happened between us over the years, and what kind of relationship we wanted to have going forward, whether there was still enough honesty between us to build something real on. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought he could do that. I told him to come on Sunday. I'd make coffee. He said he would. He came on Sunday. He came alone, which I hadn't expected. I had assumed Renata would be with him, or that her absence would be offered as an explanation immediately defensively. The way people explain things when they are still managing a position rather than having a conversation. But Daniel just came in through the front door, the way he had always come in. Coat on, keys still in hand. A little uncertain in the shoulders, and sat down at my kitchen table without saying much. I poured the coffee. I sat across from him. The morning light came in low through the east window, the way it does in November, casting everything in that flat, honest light that doesn't flatter or obscure. We didn't start with the house. We started somewhere further back than that, the way honest conversations between parents and children often have to, going back past the recent wound to find the place where the distance actually began. We talked about his father, who had passed in 2017, and how that loss had changed things in ways neither of us had properly named at the time. We talked about the early years on Sycamore Bend, when Marcus was small and the house still felt like possibility rather than assumption. We talked about how easy it is, when someone loves you quietly and without complaint, to gradually stop registering the love and start registering only the silence, to let generosity become invisible because it has always been there. He didn't make excuses. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. He said, "At one point, and I find myself returning to this, I think I stopped seeing you as a person somewhere along the way. I started seeing you as a situation we had already handled." I didn't respond right away. I looked at my coffee cup. Outside, the yard was bare and still, the November light flat, and even across the dry grass. I sat with what he had said for a moment before I answered. "That's an honest thing to say," I told him. "It's a terrible thing to have done," he said. "Yes," I said. "It is. We didn't try to fix it immediately. We just sat with it. The way you sometimes have to sit with the truth of something before you can begin to know what to do with it. That, too, mattered to me. The resolution of the property itself was, in the end, neither dramatic nor punitive. It was never meant to be either of those things. What I had decided and what Gerald formalized over the 3 weeks that followed was this. I would not sell the house. I would not pursue eviction. I would not make any kind of public declaration or demand any formal acknowledgement beyond what the documents already provided. Instead, I would establish, through a proper lease agreement, the actual and transparent nature of the arrangement going forward. Daniel and Renata would become tenants of record. The lease would reflect fair market rent, adjusted to account for a family rate that Gerald and I agreed was reasonable given the circumstances. A portion of each monthly payment would be held in a dedicated account, with a written provision that if Daniel and Renata wished to purchase the property in the future, those accumulated funds would apply directly toward a down payment on that purchase. It was a path, a real one, built on documented terms, honest numbers, and the kind of clarity that should have existed from the beginning, not as punishment for what had happened, but as the foundation for whatever came next. Gerald sent the lease agreement to Daniel in the first week of December. Daniel reviewed it with his own attorney, which was a reasonable thing to do and exactly what I would have advised him to do. There were 2 minor revisions requested. We accepted one. We declined the other, with a brief written explanation of why. The lease was signed before Christmas. I filed the executed copy in the folder behind the original deed and closed the drawer. Renata and I have not spoken at length since October. I hold that distance with some sadness. I want to say that plainly. She is the mother of my grandchildren, and whatever her role in what happened, I don't believe she is a malicious person. I believe she is someone who allowed convenience to harden into assumption over time, who allowed another person's generosity to become, in her mind, simply the way things were, the permanent background condition of a life she had built on top of someone else's foundation, without ever quite registering the weight she was standing on. That is a human failing. I have my own. I am not interested in a ledger. What I am interested in, what I will not negotiate on, is a relationship built on the honest acknowledgement of what is real, not on the premise that my silence means consent, not on the assumption that my patience is the same as my powerlessness, not on the quiet institutional erasure of a person who spent 9 years paying for, maintaining, and protecting something she was slowly being written out of. I had let that go on too long, not from weakness. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. I let it go on from love, and from the particular blindness that love produces when it goes unacknowledged, long enough that you stop noticing what is missing. Eventually, I noticed. I said something not with words, but with documentation, and with the calm, procedural authority of someone who had kept every receipt. Some people mistake silence for permission. I had allowed that mistake to stand for longer than I should have. When I finally corrected it, I did so quietly, legally, and with complete documentation. That was enough. It has always been enough. Marcus came to visit me on his own in January. 9 years old, serious in the way that certain children are serious, the way that makes you feel they are absorbing far more than they let on. He sat at my kitchen table in the same chair his father had sat in 2 months before, and asked me, with the directness that children sometimes have when adults have been careful around them for too long, whether everything was okay. I told him that everything was being worked out. He nodded, slowly, with the gravity of a child who has heard adults use that phrase enough times, to know it means something complicated and probably not finished yet. "Grandma," he said, after a moment, "is the house still yours?" I looked at him for a moment across the table. "Yes," I said, "it is." He seemed to find that satisfying, in the way that children find certainty. Satisfying not because they understand all of it, but because at least one thing is clear. He asked if I had any of the shortbread cookies I sometimes made. I did. We sat together and ate shortbread, and talked about his school and his friends, and a book he was reading. And for a little while, the folder in the filing cabinet and the lease agreement, and all of it receded into the background where it belonged. That was a good afternoon. One of the better ones I can remember from that whole long season. I've thought, since everything settled, about what I would say to someone in a similar position. Someone who has given quietly for a long time and found themselves slowly written out of the story they helped create. Someone who confused their own generosity with invisibility, or allowed others to make that confusion for them. I don't have a speech prepared. I never did. What I have is this: the documentation was never about distrust. I kept those records the way I kept all records, because I had learned, over a long career, that clarity is its own form of kindness. that knowing exactly where things stand protects everyone involved, not only the person holding the folder. The records I kept were not a weapon and were never intended as one. They were a structure, and when the structure was needed, it was there. Authority doesn't come from saying something first. It comes from having built something real, maintained it faithfully, and known always, without exception, exactly what your name was on. My name was on the deed. It still is. That was enough. It was always enough. If stories about quiet boundaries and the dignity of keeping your own records resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. There's always more worth understanding.